Hello everyone, today we talk about Renaissance cavalry weapons across Europe and parts of Asia. We will keep it broad, we will not talk just about arms, partially also about armor, about the broader panoplogical system of, in fact, the rider and his main weapon. As such, we will also illustrate some specific historical types of cavalry that are iconic from this period, roughly between 1500, 1650, maybe it's something slightly prior. These videos are sort of some necessary completion of a broader arc of Renaissance warfare that we are still far from completing since the beginning of Schwerpunkt, as far as just these introductory foundations are concerned. As you will see in the topics comment down below and also in the relative playlists of all these topics, I already made some videos about Renaissance weapons, especially some gradually anachronistic ones, at least in certain contexts. We're talking about the longbow, the crossbow, the composite bow, even though in fact the latter in particular will remain at some point, even beyond the modern age, around, and an exception can be made here and there also for the previous ones too. So how to start? We can naturally observe the general trope of the idea the Renaissance is a time of change. These weapons, cavalry weapons in particular, not in particular because obviously infantry weapons witness the greater changes. As we'll see now, this is the point I was making, the counterpoint, that cavalry weapons do not actually change that much, right? So if you look at modern warfare, like the rhetoric is always, these weapons underwent a major evolution. But in technical terms, not quite, right? It is true, however, that when you look at traditional cold steel arms, naturally, of course, modern warfare witnesses an important change in arms as well, right? But compared to the broader sort of development of especially pike and shot warfare, cavalry maintained actually a much more archaic and functional purpose that was never really fully suppressed. And in fact, this is the interesting point of it all, that the moment of greatest contraction, mid-16th century, did not put this disappearance of cavalry, not even probably the charging one. As a matter of fact, that's the only thing that cavalry normally does. Even the Reiter would throw, eventually, they're pretty expensive down with will-lock pistols against their opponents before charging. And the entire point of cavalry is that, as an arm, by definition, can't but attack because it has no other purpose whatsoever. And of course, you can attack also in skirmish mode, to speak some video game jargon, but at the end of the day, the impact of horse and rider against the enemy is always something that actually terrifies. And not just because of the actual devastating physical impact that also cavalry always is designed to fulfill, so to say, but this psychological underpinning of the saying, like the fact that by sheer deterrence, even just being outflanked by cavalry, even by lighter cavalry in a broken, loose formation, so to say, is something devastating. And in the battlefields of here, we don't just talk about Europe, as we said before, but of the world, this is actually, and outside of Europe even more, telling the truth, quite well documented, right? Of course, as we'll see today as well, traditional cold steel arms coexisted and merged with rapidly developing gunpowder technology, so that guns were started being used by cavalrymen as well. And perhaps it will start from the very end of the Middle Ages, because there had already been handgunners. You can argue ever since handguns had been used, right? Horsemen continued, however, to rely, obviously enough, on lances for charges, as they would do forever practically, but supplemented them with a wide variety of swords, short pole arms, bows, and increasingly effective firearms that changed how cavalry fought, obviously enough. This would change anyway, even if firearm technology had not been around, right? as you can see also from the previous centuries, but changes are more consistent when you look at the types of weapons, with what they were coupled essentially. Now, apart from the lances already common for mounted charges, most European cavalry also carried a long, straight, double-edged sword as their primary sidearm, well suited for both cutting and thrusting from horseback. If you look back, I don't know, the migration era, this had already been the same case, even though at this point we don't see a primarily long sword on horse. We actually see it still, but armor as well is becoming, especially for the elite, something a bit more complex, as you know, from the later Middle Ages to breach, so to say. And so also there you have important types of impediments, in particular the fact that while on foot, for example, double-handed weapons at large, not just swords, were necessary to basically unhinge what kept plate armor together. On horseback, you can't use a double-handed weapon, at least with any functional proficiency. And so everything sort of takes some interesting directions. Now, cavalrymen at this point, I'm making some general case here, then we will see probably the various type of units, frequently added to shorter backup weapons such as maces and pole axes. These were useful also, as we said before, to actually attack other heavily armored horsemen. These were compact arms with an axe blade on one side and hammer head on the other, which were often slung from the wrist for quick access in the chaos of close combat. Normally, these weapons were used by heavier cavalry because in order to come so close with an opponent on horseback for an opponent that is himself on horseback or on foot, you must be very well protected. And this is, in fact, a trend that existed since ever, right? The shorter weapons, actually, the maces in particular as anti-armor weapon, were the prerogative of the knights of the top nobility. Next to lances, however, that were always, especially in the charging phase, of course, the way to go, the most important weapon for that kind of tactic. These pole axes were still carried by cavalry during the English Civil War. When you look at a bit far east at the outskirts of Europe, you know that these were sort of very common, even in Central Europe. If you look at the Poles, right, their magnificent hussars had sort of a taste for this kind of weapons. Now, these pole axes evolved from earlier medieval designs used by knights already in the High Middle Ages, featuring robust wooden or metal hafts that allowed dismounted or mounted versatility as well. Shorter weapon, you can handle itself relatively better. It has its pros and cons, proving effective against plate armor by concentrating force on small impact points, while the wrist strap prevented loss in swirling melees, typical of 17th century clashes as well. And again, there are all kinds. Some Eastern, I will say Eastern, not to say Oriental, because there was significant overlapping, apological in particular, military styles. If you look at the east of Europe, the Balkans, and so on. But these troops employed extra long, straight swords, specifically designed for piercing armor, right, reflecting influences from regions where heavy mail and plate protection remained common among elite warriors well into the period, allowing them to counter well-armored opponents in prolonged frontier clashes across the steppes and borderlands where mobility and reach often decided survival against nomadic or heavily equipped foes. The point is actually that, as you know, throughout this period, while especially Western cavalry will become ever less armored overall, these would historically deploy even lighter cavalrymen, and these were in fact not even meant properly to come to grips with the enemy. So what actually happens later is that firearms, especially in the West, tend to obliterate the need for at least larger components of heavily armored cavalrymen, Provided that, and this is actually a difference with the West, and it's not to say that the East had this overwhelmingly more advanced, I don't know, equestrian tradition. This isn't quite the case, and actually Western Europe at the beginning of this period is basically the single most heavily armored context in the annals of military history, before and after, right? And this, especially the 15th century, is the peak, right? So when you look at the elite, actually, the Westerners on average were even more heavily armored than the Easterners that had, of course, like, we're talking average here. It's not to say that Eastern panoplies at some point could even be thicker and tighter, so to say, than the Western ones, but they were habitually more of an elite, right, compared to the sort of, on average, more affluent Western world. Right, it was, if anything, even a greater stratification. It wasn't just a matter of absolute wealth, which also definitely had been the case for Western Europe. When we look at Western Eurasian Mediterranean, so the point of having actually an extra long straight sword seems something different, and it seems to have to do actually with an increased need for actual distance from the enemy riders, but still an anti-armor capacity against the heavies as such, right? And so something that is, for example, well exemplified by the tendency in the West. You have not much the tendency of long lances, but the tendency towards heavier armor. Think about the Maximilian. Think about that kind of armor that eventually remains among the cuirassiers, that is designed for some sort of true melee against also heavier, for example, heavier infantry, that in the East you don't find that much and requires not much just this dramatic charge, but also cutting proper a lot, right? This happens in the East, but towards slightly different type of targets, especially cavalry. So range is more important. But at the same time, you have in the East, we look at the Polish Hussars that at some point, again, in the wars against the Swedes in the first half of the 17th century, had lances that were even longer than the same Western pikes, right? And this partially facilitated the task of charging them, albeit in sort of desperate situations. But speaking of an anachronism of success, and we'll look at steppe tradition. There is this, think about the contos of classical memory, this tendency to favor really a more nimble kind of a mobile type of warfare that has to reach the enemy without, however, being reached as well in many ways. And this is interesting because in the East, also a lot of missile capacity, an importantly long-range one, remains in large quantities, because those horse archers of the steppes are also as many. Right, so in the West, you actually have sort of more firepower on horseback, but less skirmishing purpose, and generally speaking, a closer range, because at the end of the day, what these Western horsemen are mostly targeting is enemy infantry, heavy infantry, that does not escape, fights in large pike blocks, right? And so at most they have also to counter arquebusiers, later musketeers fire on foot. So it's two different systems that also significantly overlap, because if you look at, again, cuirassiers wars from the later 16th, 17th century, you start realizing that they are tendentially narrower, straight, they're like bars that you have to smash into a heavily armored opponent, but also with its own, with an important degree of finesse that eventually loses also a bit its own purpose, because it's very dangerous. You can simply break your arm in that way. But it's all relatively it's all well calibrated in the warfare that we see, and much of what we see also in sort of traditional, we want to say medieval, by approximation, type of combat is still very much there. Right, there are very interesting confrontations. For example, the Westerners said that individually taken, the Ottoman feudal sipais were better knights because they were sort of more steppe influenced than the Westerners. But the French gendarmes, when they charged all together in their order, in their heavy capacity, the Turks did not have the capacity of matching. Right, so that's actually a very important strategic indicator of actual greater civilizational achievement around the western side. And so tournaments for a good part of this period still remain a thing. Of course, they gradually decline over time, but they continue to reflect older traditions, right? By the later Middle Ages and into our Renaissance period now, specialized tournament armor became common. As you know, at this point, it was fundamentally decontextualized from sort of actual battlefield combat, right? The purpose here was to sort of still carry out a significant exertion, but with increased safety to a degree and functionality to the particular types of joust fighting, for example, exists. This was still very risky. As you know, a French king died in an accident during these exertions. Participants, however, usually fought with courtesy weapons. Lances without points, swords with dull blades, and blunted maces to reduce fatalities, although real weapons were sometimes used and serious injuries or deaths still occurred. Think about splinters, and everything can really go wrong with that sheer amount of energy of an actual hundreds and hundreds of kilos of horsemen and horse guarded properly in metal, smashing to one another, even at relatively controlled speed. Still an incredibly risky thing. And the point of these exercises, of course, is still functional to actual combat, because the first purpose is fundamentally psychological, aside from the physical exertion that is definitely extenuating, but still in that sense very different from the sort of specific physical qualities you must have gradually into the eventual combat that will take place in real war. You can say noblemen actually pulling out of the battlefield, because actually throughout all the Ancien regime, it's really, especially the smaller aristocracy, to form properly the backbone of European armies until World War I. Obviously not in a numerical sense, but this is the point. In fact, monarchs in particular tend to be ever more distant from the fray, because modern states start becoming really much more of a complex structured business, and political instability with all the problems they had at the time, chronic debt, confessional clashes, etc. Like if you started losing kings in battle, things like would have been sort of much worse. Like in prior times, actually, that had been a proper way of selecting. But you shouldn't, however, think that this tournament equestrian chivalric knightly culture died. We've seen this definitely surviving well into the 18th century and even beyond in the videos, especially about Prince Eugene. And it is true that a part of Europe, Mitteleuropa, remains a bit more sort of asleep into an enchanted medieval fairy tale, where you also have, impaling children from the Ottoman side, and skinning prisoners alive, burning everything like it. Of course, like that is part of the sort of the Dionysian side of the story, but and these are very important things, by the way, to properly form those aristocrats. But indeed, also in the West, the understanding was that a true nobleman, normally, think about the libertine ages, was about sort of war banding, still in the fairly civilized and most Western, in the sense, more lay and sort of secular parts of Europe. Like the idea of dueling, the idea of sort of getting a commission for properly for a living, right? For a regiment, right? It was completely throughout the French Revolution. Even again, it was in most areas the thing that aristocrats did, and not only them at that point, but this had deep roots. When you look at even the time passing, like if at the beginning of the Renaissance, basically this was a nightly exertions a normal thing. Really, you can't imagine that just 200 years later we are in the 1800s. So it's an incredibly short time. Looking at our chronological beginning here, combat typically ended when a rider was unhorsed or could no longer continue in this tournament competitions. These jousting events, regulated by detailed codes of conduct in royal courts like those of the Habsburgs or Tudor England, that, as you know, also crafted quite specialized and beautiful armor that is still, preserved in various armories all across, in fact, the continent, preserved chivalric ideals that had been first properly codified through specific literary genres from the 12th and 13th century, but were absolutely not born at that point. Like, they were things going on from millennia, right? The knight is definitely not born in the 12th or 13th century. That's a very materialistic and technologistic idea of it. And by the way, there isn't even a valid reason to claim that, at that point, a proper knight is born. Like in the 11th or the 14th century, like, what were the actual differences? There were, but we're looking not just at a piece of armor or just a piece of literature explicitating certain terminology and worldview, right? It's something much deeper that we made plenty of videos on in its, in fact, prehistory, or better, archaic period, because actually there is a rich history of this all. And tournaments made some videos about tournaments proper, all sort of deep archetypal symbolic meaning. They had also diplomatic functions, such as forging alliances or showcasing martial prowess during peace negotiations amid the frequent dynastic wars of the era. Tournament was so natural just in the previous centuries. It was done even during battles, when battle lines awaited to enter the fray, like the newly knighted men-at-arms normally entertained like the battle line as it was deployed in combat asset, just also to blend in and to show, like, but also to become more familiar with the exertions and so on. We don't need to descend in the doctrine of the two natures, the double, right, represented by, in fact, the soul of chivalry. It was most often the dame that rode on horseback, and you had, in the absence of the knight, as he was presented, you had the helmet that becomes this hypostatization of the higher principle of the knight, with the coat of arms, with the crest, the insignia, and so on, and the serf alongside, and we'll come back on that stuff. And so these events serve not only as training and spectacle, but also as displays of noble skill and status across European courts, helping maintain the martial culture of the knightly estate. Even as battlefield realities shifted toward combined arms tactics, they had always been about combined arm tactics, but now involving coordinated infantry, mostly pike and shot. In fact, support, also artillery, was gradually sort of increasing in relevance. You have, at this point, artillery as a fully fledged arm employed in open field engagements as well, which had not really been the birth of artillery, regardless of also the introduction of firearm technologies per se. We could really open a massive ravine of digressionary considerations on all this at every step of the way in this video, because there's just so much behind all of this. But we'll stick to a simple overview, right, as we will eventually cover all these various units in detail. Light and medium cavalry developed distinctive regional arsenals. There isn't really technically something like medium cavalry, if not by level of armor, right? Cavalry is just heavy and light, right? There can be some, of course, degrees of this, but tendentially, like, either you have a cavalry that is meant to specifically engage into hand-to-hand combat, or a more skirmish-based one. You can have all kind of overlapping dimensions, but tendentially, right, the role is already pre-established, right? Then it's obvious that, I don't know, even horse archers can be heavy against one another because they're peer at that point, but they fight in an army with combined arms tactics, so that's why they matter and how warfare is always fought. Now, at the end of the 15th century, Spanish Jinetes and their officers used swords, javelins, and crossbows, valuing mobility and versatility. The Iberian Peninsula was, as you know, politically compacting under the union, essentially, of the Castilian and Aragonese domains. This will become essentially an Habsburgic monarchy, even though the various realms will remain separated up to pretty late in time. And as you know, this region had gone through literal several centuries of so-called Reconquista that technically had finished in the 13th century, but say is normally extended conceptually because of the last Muslim avampost, regardless of whether it had already become a vassal after Las Navas remained in Spain. That, by the way, had lots of problems with the converts, with the pretty big convert Mudayars population of Jews and Muslims, but also other social issues that the Ottomans, with their piracy, their privateers in particular, would make great leverage or just by passing by like the Mediterranean coast of Spain and sort of giving support to different insurrections were also bloodily repressed, among other things. We should make a video about the military history of that because it's quite fascinating. So it was not an easy moment in history, so to say, especially considering how the Turks now sort of had broken the de facto Christian dominance that had occurred for half of a millennium, as we've seen also yesterday with the turning tides with Genoese warfare. Now, the particularity of the Jinetes, as you know, is the fact that they were light horsemen, very light horsemen, drawing from Iberian traditions that you can even there think about Cantabrian gallop and sort of the various traditions of the Celto-Iberian tribesmen had always been about this hit-and-run tactics. It's not the Caracole Arabic tradition that somehow reinjected that style. Also because at that point, the Arabo-Berber armies that swarmed across the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century were mostly infantry-based. Like, they didn't have this pretty robust cavalry dimension. And there are reasons for this. I will not digress on how and why socioculturally the Jinete had been that important in millennia in this part of Europe. But indeed, it also honed during, as a tradition, during centuries of interaction with, say, North African Muslim forces that eventually sort of were tendentially lighter than, in fact, the heavier, increasingly westernizing knights, men-at-arms of the Reconquista that, however, had in their retinue this lighter kind of cavalry, exactly to counter, in a tendentially symmetric fashion, these Muslim opponents. 4 centuries, again, of constant warfare practically, operating effectively in this Iberian Peninsula as also very varied terrain against both Christian and Islamic forces, by the way, emphasizing hit-and-run tactics that proved highly effective in reconnaissance and skirmishing during the final stages of the Reconquista, which concluded, as we've seen with a video, about the times and meaning of the fall of Granada in 1492, a sort of fatal year, so to say, the discovery of the Americas, the death of Lorenzo il Magnifico, and so properly what can be considered as the Renaissance, ushering in, or at least the modern age in particular, if you want to draw a line there. And interestingly enough, the Jinetes were an interesting, almost unique component of the Spanish roster, so to say, compared to other countries in Europe, because there were obviously, as we'll see now, other lighter horsemen, but those owed more to the steppe tradition, whereas Spain, that also had historically during the Islamic period military influences that arrived up to the Middle East and Central Asia, and there are actual apological and archaeological proofs of this, mostly owed this type of fighting to this local tradition that emphasized mostly skirmishing with javelins even, right? And you would not be surprised to see, for example, in the Italian campaigns following the fall of Granada during the Italian wars, in fact, not just the Spanish, but also other Europeans partially using, not as much as the Spanish, but still, javelins that were actually quite effective against armor, especially in siege warfare, right? Even though the Jinetes were mostly, again, skirmishers on horseback, and so maneuvering in open plain, right, with their agility allowing to, in fact, circumvent, outflank heavier opponents in rugged landscapes, and supporting, however, also the larger Spanish tercios formations in European wars, right? The Spanish, for example, and they weren't unique in this, but eventually, as you know, the Spanish army, especially with Gonzalo de Cordoba and his legacy, becomes the strongest in Europe. Initially emphasized also the rodeleros swordsmen together with the pike and the shot, right? Even though the purpose for swordsmen will remain throughout all the period, because you can't, for example, fight with pikemen in a siege or in a urban battle. You have to pass to the sword, obviously enough. And this is true actually since the Middle Ages, where pikes were used much more than we normally think. Also from a quantitative point of view, they're differently trained and they have a different purpose, but don't think, I made some videos about this, that, I don't know, early Renaissance armies were bigger than 13th, 14th century armies, and including for the number of pikemen. We've seen how, for example, in the late Italian communes, the individual wings of a single battle line were normally counting more pikemen than an entire Swiss army of the Renaissance, right? So it's something that we still have to cope with and to come to terms in the history of the art of war, as opposed to this, despicable concept of the infantry revolution and et similia, that actually is a completely, it has been debunked by its own proponents in many ways, but it's so myopic and so revealing of the complete lack of understanding of anything that came not just before, but even after, because if the term revolution is just terrible, but if you really have to apply it to the major scaling up in the art of war, but definitely the second half of the 17th century is way more of a revolution than the previous period, where that instead remains sort of sealed off from the later developments. And so that's for telling you how far from an actual military culture, strategic education, and military history, and history of the art of war in particular, we really are. Jinetes typically employed feigned flight maneuvers known as tourna-fuye, which means to turn and flee, swarming enemies with, which, think about the famous Parthian shot as well. And the skirmisher, in any case, that wasn't a Parthian prerogative, can always do that. Swarming enemies with javelins before charging disordered foes, if they had been adequately softened up. Normally, the lights didn't do that. They could help out flanking, especially at the end of the battle, if it had gone well, chasing the enemy, also because heavy cavalry at that point would have done most of the work, actually, to smash heavy infantry, and they were exhausted, right? It's not much, they couldn't chase lighter elements, but they were probably not, even as noblemen, they were normally cutting down the enemy, mowing down lesser people, like on foot, like was not the prerogative of sacred blood, right? And so you have also this interesting mixture of the Jinete style that admittedly lasts just so far. Here we will go by chronological order of types of cavalrymen. Here we are at the end of the Middle Ages. Eventually, for most of this period, you don't find Jinetes in warfare. But still, Berber Moorish light cavalry kind of kept fighting like that. In fact, it's interesting how in the clashes in North Africa, the Spanish, the other Europeans will find actually this same type of warfare pretty late in time. In any case, when you look at the end of the Middle Ages and battles like, again, in Granada, in the Apennines, etc., you realize that having Jinetes in certain areas is pretty effective. Right. Normally they rode with shorter stirrups and bent knees in the distinctive Jineta style that enhanced maneuverability for throwing darts accurately at full gallop, but also for protecting themselves more, like to be smaller targets. This is in fact something that happened in steppe warfare as well. It's both balance and protection defense, because these troops were largely unarmored, right? You have saddle pommels and short stirrups, allowing the rider also to stand and twist for better javelin throws at a point or sword work, proving superior in the broken terrain of Iberia, where heavy knights often struggled. With this kind of riding, you could absorb shocks better and maintain aim, even on a bumpy ground. Besides, don't think that lighter cavalry is simply sort of fresher, nimbler, and sort of happier about this. Actually, in order to carry out this hit-and-run tactics and to inflict any meaningful harm on normally a heavy enemy, so someone that has both cavalry and infantry, yes, it could be slower, and they wouldn't attack you because they, even if provoked, their target was other heavies. But you have to really exhaust yourself, right? They exhausted themselves even more than the heavies at a point, right? And it was all a way to properly maintain your own energy in fights that lasted entire days, and so it's something really extenuating, to say the least. Other very interesting type, the Hungarian Hussars of the 15th, 16th centuries. Prominent under King Matthias I Corvinus, were armed with a long lance, sword, and composite bow, right? Ideally, also depending on the type of balance that there was also hopefully being achieved. We will surely make a video about the Hungarian Hussars, because this is exactly where they originated from. They had sort of also some Serbian roots, and in any case, some older one in the steppe influences of the Middle Danube, and they are the ones that eventually will create different models of warriors termed like that. For example, the Polish Hussar would turn out to be properly heavy cavalry, whereas in the West, the Hussar would maintain mostly its own lighter character. The Hungarian Hussars rode with high eastern saddles and carried teardrop-shaped shields, favoring colorful Renaissance attire and hit-and-run tactics as well. King Matthias, ruler of Hungary from 1458 to 1490, built, and I made a video about its army, built one of, in fact, Europe's first professional standing hosts, known as the Black Army. Right, it had the specific purpose of saving the Hungarian monarchy, that was sort of falling apart under pressure of the oligarchs and this chronic royal paralysis, sort of magnate anti-monarchic policy that was definitely not the best you could carry out as you were being invaded by the Ottomans. Matthias incorporated these hussars as elite light cavalry, which is an interesting genre in and of itself, because as you see here, they're actually well equipped, right? They were drawn from border regions to counter Ottoman incursions. They were elite, especially to the extent they were professional forces rather than for their equipment. The Black Army as a whole was funded through innovative taxation, including mercenaries from various nations, including Czech, German, and Serbian troops, blending local traditions with disciplined organization that influenced even later European forces through their success in defensive campaigns along the Danube frontier against expanding Islamic armies under sultans like Mehmed II and his successors, who had conquered Constantinople in 1453, and that had thus immediately projected their own power towards Central Europe, and Hungary was just the main target. The Black Army featured up to 20,000 cavalry and 8,000 infantry at its peak, even though these numbers should be treated with caution, especially because Hungary is not so documentarily reliable as other parts of the West, where we have some sort of more developed administration, greater sort of properly written practice spread for armies, recruitment, and so on. And so actually, the Black Army was a good army, to say the least, because it was a professional force, right? And it was essentially bringing Hungary to update its historical feudal system that had been increasingly complemented, in fact, with more professional forces. The Hussars evolved from the concept of the Hus, that is the 20 drafting system, where nobles equipped one horseman per 20 serfs, right? And these would be essentially lighter guys, excelling in raids and frontier defense, preserving Hungarian independence longer than many neighbors, while incorporating Hussite-inspired wagon and pavise defenses adapted for mobile operations as well, even though those were also developing, had already been existing from millennia, especially in the steppe. So, I don't know, the older Magyars had obviously employed that when they were still far east, across the Carpathians. There would be much to say about that if you're interested in Hussite warfare. I made a decent amount of videos already. We will come back on them. There isn't anything actually unique or exceptional about all these tactics. What you have to be able to assess in order to evaluate military quality per se is how the degree of professionalism, the degree of experience of how many of these men were veteran, whatever. So when we look at the Hussars, we're looking mostly at a form of organization. The fact that there were lighter troops was this bias that Hungary maintained for a couple of reasons. So since especially the Angevin era, Hungary had been in its professional element modeled after Western European hosts, right? There was a blend now between, so feudalism did not quite exist anymore, nor it had ever truly existed. You had always had to pay the nobility to fight, at least to some extra degree of what was entailed by their vassalic obligations. The point is that Hungarian society, even more than steppe influences, was pretty unequal. You had very few, again, powerful magnates, oligarchs, that basically concentrated authoritarian power, unlike the one that, in fact, they wanted politically to happen in Hungary. And so the average Hungarian was just basically a serf, right? There were islands of allegedly free people, especially in connection with royal, so those property that had been allowed to settle on the royal domain. There was some level of militarization exactly to avoid with proper military colonies this oligarchic expansion, but they weren't properly in Central Europe, especially in a country like Hungary. The preconditions for some very strong, urban development, middle-class affluence, none of this. So the average regiment of these oligarchs that would otherwise fight themselves as probably the heaviest knights available in Europe was pretty scarce, right? And this is something that strikes particularly Western sources. All right, there is a stereotype that in fact continues a bit also in this later like Hussar or the Stradiot tradition we will say now. Namely, the idea that these people at the boundary, because these weren't even necessarily ethnic Magyars, or even though there were like steppe elements, people coming from the Turkic, Pontic steppe, etc. That, in fact, at this corner of Germanic, Slavic, and Magyar warfare, there were hosts that looked like the ones of the Huns, the ones of the Magyars, like with a core of heavy cavalry was actually the decisive one, but also lots of horse archers. Right, if you look at the Neapolitan Civil War in the mid-14th century, Italian chroniclers describe this very often, also in northeastern Italy at the frontier with these places. There's this recurrence throughout the centuries, and even before the Magyars, of these kind of more steppe-looking elements that weren't even necessarily, again, fighting like that because they were ethnic steppe men that had just maintained their lifestyle, but because truly also the societal background of those lands was much more troubled in many ways. And there's a bit of a mythology revolving around these horse archers, namely the fact that they would have been capable of defeating Western armies. This never happened, right? When you see even those battles, for example, the Neapolitan Civil War, says that the Hungars, the Magyars, however they were called, never actually defeating, like no source whatsoever, anywhere for that matter. There's a deep art of war definitional point here. One, because they had horse archers, right? The one, because they largely fought also with other troops that they hired along the way, mostly German and Italian as well, as men-at-arms supported also by these raiders. They were extremely useful, extremely good at skirmishing, at scouting, at screening, all this stuff, but obviously, and by definition, did not have a decisive potential because no light cavalry, by definition, can defeat heavy cavalry. Otherwise, we wouldn't call them like that, all right? So it's obvious that, I don't know, there were 100 horse archers and an isolated men-at-arms that could happen, but that's a completely different story from actual warfare and the tendentially symmetrical and so-called conventional one. Even though tendentially symmetrical warfare is always asymmetrical for that matter. Actually, we know that at some point these Magyar horse archers are even chased down, like cut down as brigands by local Italian peasants for that. So that tells you what this thing really was. And so, even though we identify, again, the Hussar, the Stradioti, as we'll say, if you really think of them, they're the product of a very specific part of Europe that, in spite of its differences, was fundamentally destabilized, had failed states, was suffering invasions, was historically sort of less structured. But these elements, as you've seen also in the recent video about Louis XIV's cavalry, that still fits our chronology here, were eventually employed also as proper ethnics, right? We talk about the Hussars, and those weren't the later copy of some type of cavalry eventually manned by Westerners. Like if you look at the Uhlans, you have all these kind of older names of this terrible terminology coming from this Gog and Magog vibing kind of background. No, these were still already, think about Louis XIV's alliance with the Hungarians against the Habsburgs, for that matter, actually coming from those places, right? The Hussars had admittedly by that point spread in Poland, where there were also this, especially from the royal side, this sort of multi-ethnic exhibition of troops saying, oh, look at how many peoples we have from many different, many units we have from different peoples. France had partially been, as you know, very, very strongly allied with Poland for different international reasons throughout the centuries. But it's interesting, in fact, to think, not much of the distinction, but how eventually these units instantiate in the annals of military history, in their own, in the vocabulary that we use to describe them, when coming from a sort of very old and continuous, in this sense, strategic and tactical background, right? These Hussars often wore light mail or padded protection. Remember, we're still at the end of the Middle Ages, right? With distinctive pointed helmets or caps, wielding curved sabers that blended Western and Eastern forging techniques for superior cutting power in fast raids. And so you had also the extremes, something sort of heavier, multitask, multi-purpose, right? Being, for example, both a lancer and an archer is something very qualifying for a horseman. You are truly elite at that point. It is true that technically they weren't particularly heavily armored, right? But those who were, in fact, and there were, also would display sometimes these individual skills that were gradually abandoned in the West and historically, right? Also from the steppes, there was originally in the Saka period the idea that you could be both a shock heavy cavalryman and an archer at the same time. And eventually, I don't know, already during the Sasanian era, you have a split only between proper cataphracts, the Klibanari, and the horse archers, right? So this is what exactly is happening in the West, because you have a more scaled collective training, sort of technological development functionality. If you are born and raised somewhere in Hungary, you don't have that, but you're also so pressured. You're probably going to be, again, a lighter cavalryman. You're not particularly affluent. You're not paid that much in the retinue of those oligarchs that sometimes are even foreign. We'll talk about them. In Hungary, that was a very interesting dynamic. But in this sense, you would have developed a tendentially more individual kind of fighting, because warfare was relatively smaller in scale, and or it was more frequent for you as that type of trooper to be sent out there like as a raider, as opposed to fight in a battle line in a broader formation. And that's here we switch, continuing our chronologic marathon today of this type of units, talking about the Venetian Stradioti. These were light cavalry mercenaries of Greek, Albanian, Croat, and Hungarian origins. It was a synecdoche for, as you know, it's a Greek-derived term, stratiotai, which is meaning soldiers. And combining also in this case, to say the least, Eastern and Western equipment, right? The These were mostly Albanian, that's what we understand. Actually, a very underrated type of Stradiot was the Neapolitan one. The Neapolitans actually had better Stradiots than the Venetians. They even fought against each other, and actually the Neapolitan ones won. So there's very interesting research made on this subject. And at some point, I think I never really made a video about the Neapolitan army. We absolutely must cover that, because it was also a might to be reckoned with. And the main Stradioti weapons, however, and again, we stick mostly to the Venetians because they became, in any case, later to be more famous. But again, there were lots of Albanian colonies in southern Italy, so that today, actually, as you know, there are some islands of Albanian, historically spoken, that are not, I don't know, because of post-communist Albanian immigration, it's this probably the refugees of the Ottoman invasion at the age of Skanderbeg and so on. The Stradioti's main weapons included long lances for charges, composite bows for range attacks. There was paradoxically more horse archer vibe in the Balkans than in Hungary at this point, because the Balkans, ever since the disgregation of the Byzantine Empire with the Fourth Crusade, had been heavily Mongolized, as a matter of fact, and Turcified to a degree that had deeply impacted all involved. Like Albanians, as you know, were peoples of shepherds. They lived in the highlands, etc. Mostly were raiders. They did what they had historically always done, regardless of this. But they were also influenced in these styles of combat by the Easterners. They had sabers or swords for close combat as well. Not much armor to begin with. Some Croat units used the local broadsword known as the Shavona or Schiavona, that in fact stands for probably the Slavic weapon. And there are actually many different types of blades. It would be extremely interesting to make a video about this when you look at what is the Schiavona and how many types can we actually document also in later history, because these areas, remember, the Ottomans have actually destroyed, like they take over the Balkans, they destroy the Kingdom of Hungary, so there's a radical Turkish and Tatar influence all across, right? And so much of these peoples, the Magyars, the Croats, sort of are, they stepify, right? Some, again, meaning that the Magyars in part had been that at a point, the Croats, really not, because they had been the sedentary Slavs all along. If you're interested in the Croat appearance at this point, I also made a video about the military dress of Catholic German armies. And Croat units were, as you know, quite out there, especially in Habsburgic armies, in fact, as they function as military colonists on the Krajina, on the frontier with the Turks. And they were potentially loyal to the empire as opposed to the Turks, unlike the Magyars. But back to our Stradiots, recruited extensively by the Republic of Venice for her defensive wars in the Mediterranean and Italian mainland. Think about their participation at Fornovo, that apparently sort of brought, it's not clear whether the Italians scapegoated them for the eventual sort of draw against the French, but they were expected, the Stradiots were expected to attack the French from the rear instead. They typically, as normally this type of cavalry did, all throughout, you see it in the Middle Ages, the Germans using the Kumans, for example, were Turks, admittedly, so it's slightly different. But they fought, this is the point, only the same way. They had come to plunder the French camp. And so these troops were used during the 15th and 16th centuries, in particular against, especially the Ottoman expansion that the Venetians obviously waged in the Eastern Mediterranean, and making, in fact, many of their avantposts close to that same Albanian hinterland for which they could hire some of these people that were naturally thirsty with Turkish blood. These irregulars brought hardy Balkan horsemanship, by the way, that doesn't have to be underestimated. Granted, it was, again, normally light, but again, it has a specific tactical function. The Venetians have, as we've seen also in the video about Colleoni and about the Venetian army organization at this point, like incredibly heavy and good. troops, together with the Burgundian army. It had been the strongest force in Europe in the third quarter of the 15th century. But here you have, again, that lighter element that normally in Europe you don't otherwise have. Here we're looking at fringe aspects. The Jinetes, during the Reconquista, these guys, again, that you can record starting from essentially the steppes, because the steppes beginning Hungary, right? Europeans at large do not have these, except in this case. And again, the Croats, the Albanians, for the Austrians, the Italians, etc., are very, very useful in this regard, especially when they fight against the Turks, as you understand, because the Turks have a lot of that kind of lighter cavalry themselves. And Balkan horsemanship is rooted in rugged mountain warfare traditions from the fractured Byzantine successor states and Ottoman border wars. Right? Byzantine legacy in this cavalry is somehow sensible. Admittedly, the Albanians had never been particularly civilized, whoever had ruled over their lands. But there is there also think about all those Turkic auxiliaries that the Byzantines had been using increasingly since ever, practically, and partially settling them in the Balkans. These things influence you at some point. And the Stradiots had flexible weaponry suited to fluid frontier warfare against the Ottomans and other foes, like the Tatars, excelling in raids and screening maneuvers that protected Venetian trade routes and colonial interests in the Adriatic and beyond, often operating as paid professionals who earned bounties for enemy heads or prisoners. Stradioti, largely Albanian in origin with Greek captains, which is part of that Byzantine legacy we were talking about just now, wore mixed Ottoman Byzantine European garb. It's very interesting. If you look at some stamps by Dürer, you find a very peculiar fashion, including male hauberks later upgraded using javelins, maces, crossbows, and eventually gunpowder arms, pioneering light cavalry roles that influenced wider European mercenary practices through hit-and-run ambushes, feigned retreats, rapid reconnaissance that echoed the same Ottoman Akinci tactics. Their distinctive conical felt or reinforced paper caps from Albanian Liberia regions offered surprising protection, because they were properly with a metal skeleton and with sort of felt on it, allowing excellent visibility and ventilation during long patrols. And so it's almost like the cylinder hat that will later sort of affirm itself more widely in European fashion, like from the 16th to the 20th century. We can look at the far east of Europe with the Muscovite Boyars of the late 16th century. I made, in the very early days of Schwerpunkt, some videos about Ruthenian cavalry of the later Middle Ages. So this can apply at large for most of Eastern European cavalry at that point, for the Christian side. They went into battle heavily equipped with lances, javelins, scimitars, maces, and by later decades, pistols as well. Their principal weapon, however, remained the composite bow, interestingly enough, which fired from a jockey-style riding position during surprise attacks relied on speed, numbers, and range fire rather than direct frontal charges. This tells you how deeply Mongol in nature the Muscovy really was. These Ruthenian noble cavalrymen were essentially fighting mostly as skirmishers. Right? They obviously had a shock capacity and component, but at large, right? That's how gradually the Muscovite state enlarges, by the way, throughout this period, because sources are incredibly scarce. Even the top horsemen were part of a service nobility system tied to land grants known as pomestia under Tsars like Ivan IV, also called the Terrible, who ruled from 1533 to 1584. At this point, you actually have a dramatic expansion of the Muscovy, especially sort of across the eastern regions through conquest of the Tatar Khanate, operating in the vast steppes and forests of Muscovy as it expanded against neighboring powers, but preserving nomadic influence, mounted archery traditions that complemented emerging firearm adoption under rulers seeking to modernize their forces amid ongoing threats from steppe nomads who themselves relied on similar hit-and-run archery tactics perfected over centuries from the legacy of the Mongol Golden Horde, from which the same Muscovites had sort of barely emancipated in the later Middle Ages, but never quite in a social-cultural sense. Actually, a lot of this Muscovite nobility had Mongol blood themselves. Boyar sons and Dvorani household troops emphasized the Mongol-style composite bow as their hallmark weapon. I would like to stress how Eastern this is. Like, this is something that normally happens in Asia, even from an ethno-cultural point of view. Like, in the West, the central weapon is the sword, right? In the East, you look at the bow in really different ways. And so it's actually incredibly fascinating how still even the terrible reforms created more structured service obligations that blended still the traditional archery with early pistol use for versatile steppe warfare, while concentrating military loyalty through pomestial land grants that replaced unreliable boyar feudal levies. And so gradually things were moving forward, but when I say gradually, it is really gradually. It would be interesting actually to make a video about the sort of Timofeyevich and the conquest of Siberia, right? But that's also telling you how paradoxically, so at that point, pike and shot as they were gradually forming were putting in crisis steppe forces, but there is also a very long history of Mongol raids, right? Still in the very last years of the 16th century, the Tatars plundered Moscow, just for making you understand what we're talking about. If you look at the different steppe peoples, they harassed the Muscovites successfully until the 18th century. So there's a very interesting military history there to see, while actually the growth in the West was not negligible, but in part limited at the northern Ruthenian world, and still having this major power of Poland, Lithuania to tackle. We're not talking about the fact, as we've seen also in our recent video about the Cossack raids in the Ottoman Empire, that Ukraine was very distant from being part of anything under Moscow. Like, it will take centuries before that happened. Now, in the 17th century, and so passing actually to the Commonwealth, Polish Panserney represented a powerful Eastern style. Armed with long spears, the Ratina, capable of piercing mail, the curved żabla and carabela sabers for slashing, straight concierge swords, composite bows, and pistols carried in ornamented saddled holsters. Right, these troops were excellent at both range harassment and close quarter fighting. It is actually what I was saying at the very beginning of the video regarding the idea of not down the line a bit more in the video, like this dual adaptability. That in fact the Polish Panserney really represent as an anachronism of success, like excellent horsemanship, but also actual military power that could be successfully displayed against sort of more Western kind troops and Eastern ones. This is quite fascinating also because at the end of the Middle Ages, Poland had actually fully westernized its cavalry. This is something that gets very rarely appreciated in the development of Polish-Lithuanian warfare, that process of westernization of Central Europe, mostly under German influence, had fundamentally been completed in Poland by the end of the 15th century. We can't look at a Polish army at that point and spot, for example, lighter horses, unless they were, I don't know, some auxiliary force. Obviously, there were more medium cavalry. This existed, also lighter ones in the West, but they were part, in fact, of a normal complement of some sort of support troops, sometimes even field aids, whatever. But if you look at a Polish men-at-arms, like it wore like a typical Gothic armor, but there wasn't really anything suggesting that the system would go towards an eastern direction. When, however, there is the stricter consolidation of probably the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because there had been a previous union, as you know, since the 14th century, but it's not until this point that Poland has to virtually take over properly the entire, also Lithuanian and Ukrainian, so the Ruthenian Palatinate lands, that the Polish Szlachta and the same Polish monarch have to sort of easternize their cavalry. And that's where the Panserney are born, at least in that typical idea of the Hussar, right, that we appreciate later, right? There is a lot there happening. There is the debate about the actual wings. The Delhis had that from the Ottoman side. You had actually a very long tradition in the same Central Europe of particularly elaborated crest with feathers that arrive up to Germany, Scandinavia. So actually, the steppes have a much wider influence than we normally think at this point. And so the point being that the Poles increased drastically their number of cavalry, also lighter cavalry, in order probably to cope with the various enemies of this, as you know, territorially immense domain. Like, it's something enormous, like the Commonwealth's dominion. And there is all a history here. Serving within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's military during its wars against Sweden in the Deluge. I also made a video about Charles X invasion of Poland, which devastated the region. The Deluge is not just that, but say we are in the mid-17th century. You have, at that point, in fact, a much more eroded situation. You have the Muscovites that have gained ground, the Ottomans that are still dangerous, but beatable, as we've seen also in a recent video about, in fact, 7th century Polish-Ottoman warfare, if we're not talking about the series on Vienna. And so you have the Panserney, often recruited from the middle nobility or Szlachta estate, known for its extensive political privileges, but in this sense representing, as I was saying before, that backbone, probably of the smaller aristocracy, led by oligarchs, obviously, that made up probably the core of the Polish army. A revolt probably around this. In fact, Polish infantry was pretty scarce, telling the truth, in quality. And that's the other yet very interesting development. Like, the Poles had invested so much in this cavalry renewal that, a bit for the same reasons we said before about Hungary, that, you know, these countries did not really have much of a middle class to draw like strong infantry with, even as militia, like, I don't know, the German burghers and so on. In fact, they normally, for heavy infantry, they imported German mercenaries, right? They hired those. They were also close to get, right? And more easily deployable, in fact, at the frontier with actual sort of similar powers. Besides, I don't know, Danzig was part of the Commonwealth, so they had there at least pretty rich militia, admittedly not serving much elsewhere, but still defending at some point the Commonwealth itself. And so you have the Panserney forming the versatile medium cavalry backbone, protected by mail shirts and capable of sustaining prolonged campaigns across Central Eastern Europe's diverse battlefields, often operating in mixed formations that balance firepower with traditional shock action and supporting the famed winged hussars that were sort of the top of them, so to say, in decisive charges that leveraged momentum and psychological impact for their feather wing decorations designed to intimidate foes and deflect arrows. And so you have here I suppose it's a bit like saying the difference between the average knight, sort of man-at-arm in a knightly mounted sense in the West versus the gendarme per se, right? You have this different levels of heavy cavalry development that fundamentally tend to align at the top. All right. Think again the multitude of enemies that they had to face in general. The Panserney, in sort of topological terms, developed from earlier Cossack-style armored cavalry, at least in part, increasingly favoring carbines alongside traditional arms, providing mobile firepower while retaining length options later in the 17th century, forming a key bridge between light and heavy cavalry in Commonwealth armies that often comprised the majority of mounted forces in later decades. I made a video about the Polish-Lithuanian army organization both in the 16th and 17th century. You can see there how also Dragoons were being developed and in exploiting, especially these Eastern, especially the Ruthenian and Ukrainian traditions of this sort of lighter cavalry habituated to hit and run tactics and so on. The Poles maintained, as the nobility that also ruled those lands, mostly from the cities. Well, basically the agricultural hinterland was all Ukrainian. And this gives you an idea also demographically of how elite they kind of were, even as a military class. Were adapted themselves to, in fact, much looser battlefields, right? Unlike the ones of Western Europe, both the Ottomans, the Muscovites, the Nogai horde, etc., like fight in ways that are, and also they have to fight against the same Cossacks at some point, even though some of these were registered as military colonists properly in the Polish military administration roles, and so. But again, there would obviously be this lighter bias, right? And in fact, at some point, the Commonwealth was close to achieve also this sense of being Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian. And unfortunately, this did not happen for different reasons. And this brought also to a series of disasters in European history in the following centuries. And this, again, it's incredibly recently that the Muscovite came to control some of those lands, and there are parts of today's Ukraine's national state that were in Russian control, not even a century in total. So this is extremely interesting, and this speaks also of the history of these other powers, of different empires, of nations rising, falling, disappearing from the map at some point, like Poland, dissolving in a multinational sense like the Habsburgs. Now, this medium cavalry frequently wore full mail shirts with additional plate elements at times, depending on the heaviness, on shoulders or chests, using teardrop or round shields in earlier periods and excelling in prolonged pursuits or defensive screens during exhausting campaigns of the luge. Shields, as you know, in the West were practically not used anymore from the essentially from the 16th century, right? But in the East, with all that kind of more traditional warfare, lots of arrows around, you actually have an important use of the shield. We go now far east, right? Because we haven't really made too many videos about Japanese warfare, but we're trying to make up for that. And we talked about the stereotypical Japanese mounted samurai of the 16th century, primarily using asymmetrical bows for combat from horseback, with the design specifically suited for shooting from the saddle, also here. Consider that Japanese military culture owes much more to the steppes than to China, right? This is true for Korea as well. Especially the more back in time you go, right? The steppes make this circle around China, and they end up probably also in the Japanese islands. The mounted samurais also carried long single-handed tachi swords for mounted fighting, obviously not. Over time, in fact, there is this sense that, again, the bow is just the primary weapon. There is a lot of importance, as we said before, attached to it, but it can hardly be the primary weapon unless you're always fleeing, right? So obviously also in a system like Japan that remained fairly isolated, and Japanese, meaning they mostly fought against each other, it makes you really think that at large their type of equipment could remain in part so set on archery, but at the same time, obviously, you had to get into hand-to-hand combat at some point. Nothing is so strange, and perhaps Japanese exceptionalism in warfare has been hyper-inflated for some misunderstandings into how their warfare actually worked. Over time, as the swordplay became more central, in fact, and warfare shifted toward larger coordinated battles during the civil wars, samurai increasingly adopted shorter two-handed katana for foot combat as well. This had already been the case from a long time. Again, there is not really any signal back in the centuries of Japanese warfare that tells us, no, at some point they used just the bow as simply the primary weapon, right? It came out to be really handy, but it's not like Japanese battles for some reason had to work differently from the rest of the world, right? Commanders like Takeda Shingen led cavalry charges that combined spears and swords in aggressive close combat. This was the powerful daimyo known as the Tiger of Kai, who dominated much of central Japan in the mid-16th century Sengoku period of warring states marked by constant feudal strife before eventual unification under later leaders pioneered mass lance cavalry charges that in this sense also greatly upscaled Japanese mounted warfare, but also art of war, transforming the samurai elite from this actually erroneous concept of them being primarily archers into definitely more robust shock troops feared for their disciplined assaults, most famously demonstrated in battles such as those at Kawana-Kajima against rival Uesugi Kenshin, where coordinated horse and foot tactics decided key engagements through intricate flanking maneuvers and relentless pressure amid the factional struggles for unification. Remember what I said before regarding the idea of the bow being more there as also some secondary weapon among those peoples that had some sort of more individualized type of warfare, right? It's never individualized, like in the sense that they even fought one by one, but it's obvious that if you are elite, you first of all know how to use all these weapons, right? It's absolutely normal. That's part of feudal, knightly, elite professionalism. It's not like, I don't know, a 13th century French knight used a bow worse than, I don't know, that peasant that was equipped just with that because that's how much he could afford to fight with, right? And in this sense, if you find yourself not alone, but in a situation where you're a bit the center of the action, it's obvious that, I don't know, think during a siege, right? You would use missile weapons by approaching the enemy fortifications, then obviously you will get into hand-to-hand combat. The notion that, again, the Japanese at some point were primarily about archery for some reason, and that at a point they switched towards sort of a heavier prevalence. It's not like to say that before hand-to-hand combat is denied, but that archery would be prevalent doesn't make any sense. All right, we see this clearly also from, I don't know, the Mongol invasion of Japan. There is all abundant reason to understand that this cliche is, in fact, also a pretty bad mistake in the understanding of Japanese warfare. And so you have all these other cliches to an extent. The fact that Shingen's forces employed cranes wing formations and innovative charges that maximized momentum in open plains. Everything was developing along for pretty normal patterns, right? What you see here is mostly Japan coalescing, like other parts of the world, in some more compact regional realities. Later, you have increasing, mass of troops, the so-called Ashigaru, equipped with firearms, right? That, especially at the Battle of Nagashino, had this terrific effect, famously enough, with firing a little bit similar to what was happening in the West with pike and shot warfare, like being deployed behind defensive fences and rotating these volleys of matchlocks, devastating massed cavalry assaults as well. This, again, could have happened even with concentrated bow fire in the Middle Ages. Look at the 100 Years' War, right? You have obviously heavy infantry sort of standing the ground, but now obviously firepower starts becoming more detrimental for cavalry, just as it had become in Europe. So infantry will gain an increasing importance in Japan as well. And so gunpowder changes warfare, but also in here, perhaps in more abrupt ways than in Europe, because again, in Europe, also in China, this stuff existed from such a long time. It takes really, literally half of a millennium between the introduction, or at least the appearance of firearms, which is sort of the introduction of gunpowder, is something different from the use of firearms that we know of, by the way, documentarily, and the affirmation of linear tactics, right? So you understand how slow it is. But it is true that the Japanese now were introduced by the Europeans to this increased firepower that came in a more disruptive, regardless of how structurally supportable this early formations of gunners were in Japanese warfare compared to, again, the European socioeconomic background, that sort of entered as some sort of greater game changer. I mean, Japan was fairly advanced, obviously, but think about, in a greater scale, what had happened to the Aztecs, all right, in the same century when they met the Spanish. In the meanwhile, what was happening in Europe? And so if we look at the heart of the 16th century, Western Europe in particular, we had this excursus across the fringe, but now let's look at the sort of proper backbone of Western horsemanship. Cavalry firearms became genuinely practical with the invention of the wheel-lock in Germany around 1517. It was very early, right? Germany is the most technologically advanced country in Europe at this point, just like Italy. It's very interesting that these countries would remain for a long time, the so-called, especially up to the 18th century, the idea of the weak countries of Europe, because they weren't unified, there were battlefields for the other powers, etc. But they were actually the most advanced in different ways. And the German clockmakers, in particular, because of the specific mechanisms employed, were the best wheel-lock pistols creators. And actually, these wheel-lock pistols were quite expensive, so that even before I said the Reiter threw him on the enemy, yes, because in battle, you can't even throw your sword at some point against the enemy. But a bit like the helmet scene in Saving Private Ryan. But it's totally normal, or at least it's not really normal, but it's totally plausible for to happen on sort of a more frequent basis than somebody would believe, especially probably in the heat of the deepest combat. The point, though, of sort of wheel-lock pistol is not merely, again, technological. Technology does not make tactics. It's actually the other way around, right? Technology does matter, but there is significant lag between like a discovery, its implementation, the necessity of sort of innovating and probably creating the right doctrine of employment for a given power, and sort of everything is constantly discovered in this sense. I recently made some videos explaining how generally primitive still firearm technology really is still at this point. But the real reason behind this wheel-lock pistols is not much, again, any other reason other than the fact that cavalry, heavy cavalry, and so the core of Western cavalry, there had always been a scarce amount, a minority really of lighter horsemen in Europe, was at this point largely suppressed, especially by the mid-16th century, by the peak effect of pike and shot. Right? Eventually, as the pike declines, cavalry sort of comes back, and again, there's not an eclipse. Cavalry performs the same identical function throughout all the period, but the skirmishing one is an ant at this point. It's even elite cavalry, like the Reiter, because at large they were elite. They had a hell of an equipment. They were armored because they could come close to the enemy. The other guys from the other side, they had arquebusiers and muskets, right? So that gives you an idea of the range compared to the pistol. So it's not different from what we said at the beginning in terms of those who have the shorter range weapon, whether shot or white steel, etc., is actually the better armored one because it can come closer to the enemy. This is exactly the point here as well. So what is the wheel-lock pistol? Like, this mechanism used a key to win the spring attached to a serrated steel wheel. Right, pulling the trigger released the wheel to spin against iron pyrites, producing a shower of sparks that ignited the priming powder and fired the weapon, provided the spring had not been left wound too long and lost its elasticity, a problem that once frustrated Parliamentary General Lambert when he discovered his pistols had gone dead overnight. It was not a pleasant discovery in combat, and this is for telling you, like, we are in the mid-17th century, so 1 century after this technology had properly sort of come around to begin with. It was actually becoming obsolete, as also this event partially proved. But back in the previous century, this German innovation, likely emerging in fact from centers like Nuremberg with its renowned metalworking guilds and spreading throughout the Holy Roman Empire's fragmented principalities, during the religious upheavals of the Reformation, represented a major advance over matchlocks by enabling reliable ignition without an exposed burning cord, making it especially valuable for mounted troops who needed hands-free readiness during maneuvers, and so having also this more precise, quick, reliable type of fire, because as we'll see now, these horsemen were quite elite also in the versatility, on the maneuverability, outflanking maneuvers, and so on, and they had very specific drills. Think about the Caracole one, the snail, because it sort of has the spires as it gets back, right? And as the formation sort of alternates ranks, as they came very close to the enemy, they shoot and they come back and they sort of reload back in the ranks as the progression continues. Caracole, by the way, is the Spanish for snail. And this also indicates how in the imperial world, of course, Spanish military culture was being felt very much. Like if you see the Landsknechten, for example, had a more punk version of Spanish fashion at that point, was at its high. So you have all these videos talking about different stuff. If you're interested, you can definitely find all you want on Schwerpunkt. The only point about the Reiter was that these will-lock pistols of theirs remained expensive and complex to maintain for widespread issue among less wealthy units. This is essentially still a medieval world and will remain it throughout the Ancien regime. German Reiter, also there is a term, as you know, that stands for horsemen, were also known as the Black Horsemen of the mid-16th century, exemplified the shift, right? These modern cavalry units initially relied on broad-bladed boar spears fitted with a transverse bar to prevent overpenetration. Same thing of range we were saying before, but they increasingly turned to heavy will-lock pistols that could fire lead bolts with reasonable accuracy to up to about 20 paces. That in fact is still short. Like the reason why they were black is because in other times in the history of knighthood, like armors, in order to prevent from the oxidation, like were smeared with some oil, and were the Black Knight. That's also a bit of how it was born. But there were different references, also to heraldic concepts and countercultural vibes, especially in Lutheran Germany. Now, most riders carried 2 or 3 pistols, by the way, originating in German lands as heavily armored pistol cavalry. Thus, they often clad in black painted harness to reduce rust and glare as well. There is a sort of mimetic purpose as well. The Reiters gained prominence in the religious and dynastic wars of the Holy Roman Empire, such as the Schmalkaldic War of the 1540s. I made an entire video about the Schmalkaldic. There were actually a couple of wars, but the most important was the first, and it was an incredibly important one, showing the actual superiority of the imperial model over the northern Protestant rebels, right? And you have also other troops coming from the rest of the empire, and the other possessions of the Habsburgs. You have Neapolitan men-at-arms fighting in Saxony, defeating the League and so on. But this was also very, it is interesting because it's a peak moment for Charles V, in the ultimate victory, even though it was practically impossible to control all Germany, and if these guys had rebelled, aside from confessional reasons, there were often excuses, rather because they wanted to oppose Habsburgic expansionism. You realize that how fluid eventually the various parties could really be. There was a divide in Germany between the north and the south. Mostly the line between Protestantism and Catholicism. But you understand how torn this country really was, and how much experimentalism, in fact, these wars, so-called of religion, all wars had been of religion, telling you, these confessional clashes, say better, would stimulate some local military culture. And the Reiter offered a cost-effective alternative to traditional lancers by emphasizing firepower and Caracole tactics, again, with units riding forward in deep formations to discharge pistols before wheeling away in a turning maneuver. The fact that they had a deep formation facilitated this because, as you know, the column facilitates the sort of agility of the formation as it moves, right? Because you just have to follow the guy in front of you, and it's the file openers that have, if they're experienced enough, know what to do, preserving formation as opposed to linear formations that are a bit more complicated. And the reason why obviously they didn't have this linear formation is that it took enough to reload. So it didn't make sense to have a linear formation in front, of the enemy pike and shot just to take more shots, also just exposed, like from the front. No, they operated, again, pretty snakily around enemy formations with this thin, narrow formation, but quite deep in the ranks. And as such, sort of being able to maintain constant fire as the ranks alternated and they could pour fire. It was not really very different from normal shot tactics on foot, except these were, again, complementary to sort of a different type of combative tactics. Mostly they had to cope with enemy pike formations that had to be wide instead to avoid outflanking and so on. So it's another story. And the Reiter proved effective against both armored knights and dense infantry blocks alike through repeated volleys that disrupted enemy formations without committing to risky close charges, even though these normally happen after the shooting, right? Not of every rank, but at a point. Because, these pistols shoot at close range, and they hurt, right? The Caracole involved this deep columns of up to 12 ranks advancing at a trot, with each rank firing pistols in sequence before retiring to reload, allowing sustained firepower that challenged pike formations in the fragmented politics of the empire. Well, Reiters carried multiple pistols as well in holsters and boots for successive waves of fire. And after all of this, they, again, would ideally throw their pistols on the heads of the enemy, because also, you're about to charge into the pikes, and cavalry does charge into the pikes. Again, don't think that something strange happened. This is a bit like the Japanese thing. Like, it's nonsensical things do not happen in combat. Cavalry always charge into the pikes historically, and at this point pikemen had become better, so it was more difficult. But that was the purpose of cavalry, and the Reiter were equipped themselves, as we've seen, with hand-to-hand combat, for hand-to-hand combat with swords, spears, and they, in particular situations, they would actually charge right into it. If you're interested in this, check out those battle videos I made in the playlist about French wars of religion. There was lots of Germans there too, as mercenaries, both as Landsknechten and as a Reiter as well. Besides, in general, the Caracole tactic allowed cheaper, less heavily armored troops to neutralize expensive traditional heavy cavalry through disciplined firepower drills. In some cases, in most cases, they weren't obviously the game changer. In fact, you had to recur to hand-to-hand combat, and that's why heavy cavalry existed. And the Reiter themselves remained always light cavalry in general, even though they had this also heavier bias, but they were not as heavy as the proper cuirassiers. A very interesting type of cavalryman is the mounted arquebusier. operating lighter, more manageable version of the arquebus, an early firearm descended, as you know, from 14th century handguns, right? I also made a video about Giovanni delle Bandiere that pioneered this type of soldiers. In fact, at that point with the arquebus, because it's actually paving the way to the Reiter, to the will-lock pistols sort of upgrades later on in the century, right? But the reason is that, in fact, he, as we've seen in that context, did not have much forces on his own. He had to contrast bigger armies, and so the best way that they could operate against them was by harassing them with mounted gunners, right? Attacking, I don't know, supply lines, all that kind of stuff. And so there is something innovative in this. But mounted handgunners had existed for quite a while, and as clumsy as they had actually been at some point, with some, probably the older type of handguns or pistols, however you want to call them, like the end of the Middle Ages, held on horseback with a sort of a stick to hold it. Like it's something very weird. By the way, consider the arquebus, it's a big thing, right? So there were smaller types, but it's also something very clumsy and that tends to become bigger also with the musket and so on. So it is a strange affair in the early period, but it does exist, showing that there was an actual functionality. And these long-barreled weapons later reduced from very heavy early models that weighed up to 30 kilos to more practical 5 to 7 kilos versions. That is still a lot, right? Just because you were on horseback and you could use the horse as a platform, you could afford it, because anything over 3 kilos and a half in terms of sort of single weapon is practically prohibitive for sustained combat. I mean, even the Zweihänder were fundamentally not heavier than that. It required a lot of physique to handle. Obviously, there were in battle certain things like, I don't know, shields had been particularly heavy, so, but sometimes you could fix them on the ground, or at least resting them on the ground. So everything is adapted to the specific needs of the situation. You have to be able to consider the system as a whole. The arquebus, in this case, fired stone, lead, or iron bullets and offer superior penetrating power compared to bows and crossbows. There's just the sheer amount of energy released by the explosion is something that outpaced that traditional technology, except, you have to be able to channel that both technologically and doctrinally. So that's why bows and crossbows, especially up to the mid-16th century, was still a thing. Like Tudor armies, we've seen them like operating with longbowmen pretty much up to that point, and not being really anachronistic. Just from the second half of the 16th century it really starts becoming anachronistic, just like the crossbow or any other thing that was practically not guns, right? There were some proponents at the beginning of the English Civil War that they would quickly change their mind as soon as things started escalating. We have to come back on that series, by the way. Interestingly enough, arquebuses, including the ones of these mounted gunners, had effective ranges of up to 400 paces, at least in good conditions. And of course, precision or eventual penetrativity is something completely different. But still, right? Riders often could carry multiple guns, sometimes up to 6 pistols, for example, for personal defense or additional firepower. If you look at how things eventually developed down the line in these centuries, they gradually abandoned heavy armor, at least keeping only helmets. In any case, cuirassiers maintain, obviously, their cuirasses, in fact. And in any case, the idea probably of a mounted gunner allowed greater mobility on the increasingly contested battlefields of the era. You could think about this in terms of the prevalence of firearms, as we just pointed out, over, say, bows or crossbows. Like, the idea is that you have this unprecedented level of power, so it takes, in theory, less to destabilize the enemy, especially if you exploit maneuverability, right? The enemy will do partially the same. So this actually contributes to the comeback of cavalry in later times, because you can't really beat the enemy. The enemy will counter you, but he will have, in fact, to use similar forces as well. As you know, foot gunners were particularly exposed instead. And So arquebusiers also initially provided supporting fire to heavier units while on horseback, and therefore adapting themselves to the demands of prolonged clashes that featured this. Also, extensive use of field fortifications and combined armed tactics during, for example, the Italian wars, which raged across the peninsula from 1494 to the 1559 Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis. So think about all the star forts, the traces italiennes that spread from there to the rest of Europe. A lot of military engineering, and this is the other strange aspect, like it's somehow counterintuitive, at least if you don't think at it properly. Namely, this incredible level of fortifications and the fact that that battles were not really that more dynamic than from, say, campaigns as a whole, like from medieval times. Right, this is a problem that will remain until pretty late, even the early 18th century, with variations, but still. And so this is partially valid also for pike and shot formations, and that's where you find mounted skirmishers to be of effect, because you can sort of hit and run, get the hell out of the way quickly, pepper these bigger blocks that are less wieldy and more exposed. And so inherently you have, to increase also firepower gradually, the necessity for cavalry to return also needs punching moment, like in function. Let's talk about English cavalry, for example. Why? Because English cavalry developed somewhat more slowly. First of all, after the 100 Years' War, basically England is cut off from most continental art of war developments. This is a paradox. Like England in the 13th and 14th century had been one of the great powers of Europe. It was a pretty advanced kingdom, and it had managed, in fact, to create actually the strongest army in history, in conditions at least of material parity. At the same time, in part, this had been pushed by the crisis of the bigger giant, France, that had managed to expel the English ruling house from the continent as well. And it's a northern European country. You don't have the rich French lands anymore. There is a different social stratification. England does not have much of the state that the French develop. So there's this moment in which they start lagging behind. As we were saying before, if you look at Tudor armies, up to the mid-16th century, it looked oddly similar to sort of older armies as well. They had these archaic weapons like the longbow, etc. But after that, you can't, and as you know, the money of the sacked monasteries during the Anglican Reformation start running out, aside from the navy that definitely steps up in a considerable way to withstand also the Spanish invasion and so on, the English army sort of lags behind. We'll make more videos about this. And this is also why English cavalry developed more slowly. First of all, Britain did not really have excellent breeds, etc. They had to import this stuff from, Flanders, Germany, etc. This is valid also for, saying, firearms technology from the Spanish, the Italians, etc. You have Landsknecht and mercenaries. Armor is imported again from Germany, from Italy, actually, mostly. So it's a very interesting scenario, because it's not like the English were simply demoted to some second-rank power, but almost, let's put it in this way. Mid-6th century demi-lancers served as... I made a video about Tudor cavalry if you're interested, so you can check that out, because it's explained in a bit greater depth. These cavalrymen served as medium force, fundamentally, with lighter lances that did not require lance rest. That the rest is developed properly in the later Middle Ages, at the point at which the men-at-arms lance has become so heavy that they literally couldn't keep it up with the arm, and so they needed the rest. In fact, for having the lance rest on the fundamentally was an extension of the saddle or even of armor. Some rest wore armor covering the torso down to the knees, including cuirasses and mail shirts, while lighter horse troops used minimal protection and carried pistols, arquebusiers, and petronels that were medium-sized cavalry guns as well. firearms steadily, and this type of soldier was particularly relevant also in the frontier with Scotland. There were all these types of sort of lighter horsemen for greater agility. Firearms steadily gained importance, however. By the later 6th and early 17th century, many English units rejected traditional lances in favor of pistols and other guns. These English demi-lancers represented a transitional force in Tudor armies under monarchs like Henry VIII, who broke with Rome, and Elizabeth I, who faced the Spanish Armada. Lighter than full men-at-arms, yet capable of supporting infantry in continental expeditions such as those in the Low Countries and domestic wars, reflecting England's gradual adaptation to these broader gunpowder influences from mainland Europe while retaining some lance traditions longer than many neighbors, particularly during campaigns against Spanish and French forces, where logistical constraints limited full adoption of newer pistol tactics, and in general of some properly sort of developed heavy cavalry forces. It's not like they didn't have them, but they had them in small numbers. Again, if you have a massive moat like the Channel defending you, you will mostly invest in a meaningfully structural sense in the Navy, as the English do. And for the rest, the rest of land forces were largely lagged behind. But, and this happens over time, obviously not overnight, but in part, what we saw for the Hungarian retinues, like if you are a marker lord, for example, and you're not so affluent, like when you're fighting at the border with the Scots, this traditional kind of guerrilla fighting style. So tendentially, you will opt towards some broader skirmish capacity. All right. There aren't, again, you're on an island for how dangerous the French and the Scots can be if they join forces with a landing or something. You're in a defensive mode at a bigger level, and so you consider the enormous financial restraints of the powers of this. But what you see through the development, say, of Spanish, French, German forces, is something stemming from major regional pressure. Right, so there were lots of resources, and for having, again, armies of actually modest size, but that could be reliable, more uniformed, with this new technological innovations properly taking root. And so it's actually a very complicated time, and actually one of the worst and the most horrible in European history. When we look at these issues, especially from the Protestant side, and we say that actually at this point, the Protestant part of Europe was the poorer one, right? Similar transitions are to be seen during the Dutch War of Independence. When, for example, Imperial cuirassiers and Dutch heavy cavalry moved away from lances toward pistol-armed formations, especially from the Dutch side, for a reason. Right, because they were the actual defenders, and they mostly carried out the sorties, hit-and-run tactics. They never sort of successfully faced the Spanish army in some willing pitched battle. Like Newport is the exception that confirmed the rules, and not even Nassau wanted to attack. It was the parliament that compelled him, and sort of they won almost by chance. But it was about harassing the Spanish supply lines and more. And we've seen this also in part in the videos about the Tercio, the recent one about the army of Philip IV in the 17th century. And some of these horsemen used, in fact, arquebusiers and even muskets at this point down the line. By the 1630s, pistols had become the dominant offensive weapon in any case for many horsemen. The prolonged Dutch revolt against Spanish Habsburg rule from 1568 onward, lasting 80 years and involving complex siege and maneuver warfare in the Low Countries, polders, and rivers, accelerated this change, as fluid warfare favored mobile pistol cavalry over static lance charges, influencing tactics that spread through the 30 Years' War ravaging Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, and leading to more standardized pistol-based doctrines that emphasize discipline and firepower over individual bravery. This was happening, however, still at a fairly small scale, meaning that, the Dutch were probably fighting as a republic. They had, obviously, an aristocracy, And they had historically been influenced even by the same Spanish, obviously enough. But the point is always the same. Actually, if you look at canals, ditches, like this is the best place for infantry, for defense. Right? That's how essentially the Dutch successfully resist, withhold also as offensive besiegers at some point, but still with this incredibly difficult ground that favors, in fact, them in as much as they don't have to face the Spanish. So this collective tactics are a bit emphasized also by the Protestant propaganda. But in the end, all what they were actually doing was sort of harassing the enemy with skirmishing tactics and with obviously contained numbers of mounted pistoliers, also with our heavy armor. So because the stuff cost a lot, and it wasn't even properly representative of the broader Dutch estate as a whole, and so it doesn't do much in Germany. Like this is a tactic more owing to the Reiter from the empire than some true innovation. And as you know, also the so-called sort of Dutch school was more like, again, a political club, like a Protestant propaganda that, in fact, at the beginning of the 30 Years' War displayed the complete inconsistency. The Dutch had never scaled up in a meaningful structural sense. This will not happen until the late 17th century as a proper army. In fact, I just prepared a video on that, and you will likely see it soon. You have, in fact, the Catholics crushing the Protestant Germans in the north. And that's why also the sort of other powers have to intervene. You have the Danish face, the Swedish, the French, because these German Protestants couldn't really do, even with a Dutch influence, much. Like, so the myth of the technology, of the innovation, of the Protestants who were after science, as opposed to the Catholics, it's a massive pile of BS. Like at this point, actually, the Catholics had by far the most advanced armies in technology as well, for that matter. Other interesting concept we hinted at before are the early Dragoons that are originally mounted infantry, using horses mainly for transport. They fought on foot with firelock muskets and swords, carrying small pikes to tether their horses, while officers had pistols. Although they occasionally trained to fire from horseback, charges were rare. In their primary role was providing mobile fire support as infantry. All right, so placing, again, themselves, a bit the concept we explained for the Reiter, moving this firepower somewhere could be a problem for the enemy. But also being able to pull out if any trouble occurred, emerging permanently in the early 17th century, across European armies, when in fact like enemy forces became a bit less courageous, and so they had some more purpose, like in flanking attacks, as opposed against the almost unassailable squares of the 16th century. European armies, including by the way French and Swedish forces, right, used dragoons, offering commanders flexible troops who could rapidly deploy as infantry for seizures or defensive lines while retaining the strategic mobility to outpace traditional foot soldiers. Proving invaluable in the vast theaters of the 30 Years' War, where rapid reinforcement, raiding supply lines, and scouting in forested or open terrains defined many operations under leaders like Gustavus Adolphus, to the innovative, as you know, Swedish king whose reforms transformed Protestant armies, even though, again, the reason why they were fighting like this mostly was the fact that they were a smaller army and they were plenty of money, at least provided by France, and so they could invest more in that sort of small unit tactics, combined arms interaction that, however, was in itself an admission of inferiority. So there are obviously striking Swedish victories over the Catholics during the war, but still there isn't that tactical superiority that people think of the Protestant armies just per se. You just needed a massive leader like Gustavus Adolphus to pull that off, and even all the sort of innovations that are normally attributed to him are something that at some point do not appear until the time of Charles XII in the Swedish army. And this is always the same problem when you talk about military quote-unquote reformers, that there weren't actually military reformers as we intend them, right? These were great commanders that knew how to fight and had excellent armies, but the idea of permanence of these innovations was very far from being there. Nor sometimes, like, these innovations were mature enough to properly affirm themselves in the moment. In the case of Gustavus, like, Swedish dragoons were equipped with lighter firearms and axes, even for clearing obstacles, using them effectively as mobile reserves that could dismount to hold positions or assault fortifications during his brilliant campaigns. As we've seen before, the Poles had dragoons, also from Eastern Europe, and so you see that different places do similar things for different purposes. Also, however, ending up fighting against one another and looking more symmetrical than anything. Like, the Swedish had to be again be more mobile if they wanted to take on the bigger Catholic armies. The French historically actually had pretty big armies, but they had also a slightly higher cavalry bias compared to other countries historically. So dragoons there help to complement a hell of a force. Again, I always advise you to watch my video about the Battle of Strasbourg that tells you by the end of the 30 Years' War what kind of staggering drive French infantry had, right? What kind of level of uniformity and power, and also offensive capacity probably they had compared, say, in that case, to Austrian and Bavarian forces, right? They were in theory the empire, but had sort of looser forces because they didn't have quite a monarch like a state like France, even before Louis XIV, even though he had just risen as a minor to power. We can talk here as the last model, so to say, about the English Civil War again, because we hinted at it, but as you know, there are some distinct cavalry units in this circumstance. Cavalry by the mid-17th century had matured in England into a practical balance of cold steel and firearms, not very differently actually from the rest of Europe by this point. Again, the difference with England, we pointed out before, is that there wasn't much of a statual army to begin with. Like, forces were really scarce, and basically the English Civil War was partially fought over, in fact, the same military expenses, the ship money in that case, mostly for maritime operations, but by the time of the Glorious Revolution, you would have 10 times the contribution asked compared to by the ship money injected in what was becoming the British, not even the English army, at that point, like at the end of the 17th century. They'll make more videos about that, because really there are some armies traditions that do not properly take off until this point. So types of fighters, okay, like, of course, like, it's not like the English had some random type of soldiers, because they had literally been cut off from the rest of the world. No, not at all. There is also an interesting sociocultural background, namely the clash during the Civil War between a party which is essentially royalist, nobiliar, aristocrat, and that gets, as you know, kicked out of London, and relying thus on actually some more backward lands. You have bands of clubsmen from the royalist side, and not only, for goodness sake, during the English Civil War fighting. In fact, a richer, more advanced parliamentary force that, however, is weaker in terms of quality. And royalist cavaliers were something, because they were probably the heirs of that broader historical knightly tradition. They typically carried long swords such as rapiers or Pappenheimers. As you know, Pappenheim was a famous Catholic commander of the 30 Years' War. I mean, it was probably a cavalry commander. He was probably the emblem of Catholic cavalry, Imperial Habsburgic forces. I talked about him in the video about the commanders of the 30 Years' War. If you're interested, there is all the story there. We're talking either Willock or newer flintlock pistols, right? You have then from the other side, stereotypically, Cromwell's Ironsides, relying primarily on sturdy swords and pistols. So as you see, not really different, with some officers adding carbines or small pole axes as well. And this happened from both sides, but here we really want to be describing as a stereotype. Discipline and coordinated firepower frequently proved more effective than individual heroics. and this is in a broader anthropological sense what the royalists found out the hard way eventually. It took Cromwell, so a de facto dictator, that, however, again, I'm not particularly sympathetic towards the Protestant cause or whatever, but, I have a great admiration towards Cromwell, regardless of the idea of the dictatorship. Like, what he accomplished was incredible in many ways. And in fact, I'm moving towards, also in the series about the English Civil War, towards this period later on, to what we stopped. And it's the new model army that really establishes a true modern English army tradition, right? That's the moment in which so much, even alleged, like the red coats appear, because there was also an attempt in the mid 17th century for uniformity. It hadn't quite been before. Normally it was kind of a carnival. It actually will remain for quite a while, because what is uniformation fully, really? But very different from the colored regiments of Gustavus Adolphus, most of which weren't even Swedish, by the way, and they were the best elements of the army, by the way. And many, as you know, British and Irish soldiers of the English Civil War were also veterans experienced in the matters of the 30 Years' War. That was ending right at this point. The English Civil War pitted, so therefore, this more flamboyant royalist horsemen, often drawn from the nobility and favoring aggressive charges reminiscent of earlier knightly ideals, against the more disciplined parliamentarian cavalry, trained under iron leaders like Oliver Cromwell, whose emphasis on order and repeated volleys highlighted the maturing integration of firearms with traditional melee weapons, right? Ultimately contributing to parliamentary victory through superior training and tactics that emphasize cohesion over aristocratic dash in battles like Marston Moor and Naseby. However, again, it's basically about creating an actual army as opposed to the quasi-militia that the parliamentarians had been fielding during the first phase of the war, so that the royalists had entered London, as you know, at the point. And this is interesting because the English Civil War has some slight differences also in infantry doctrine that I discuss in the series about the English Civil War. They used to discuss more often on Schwerpunkt, namely the fact that with all those hedges in England, and also because of the greater difficulty of fielding bigger pike squares, indeed, like Germany was a much bigger thing, like used muskets much more often. Like the shot became more quickly a preferred weapon. There is this shift, in fact, in the mid-17th century, like where the pike is still there, but is surpassed by the shot. This had happened also during the later 30 Years' War, but again, in the bigger battlefields of Germany with greater powers involved, actually pike blocks were still like very relevant. In England, it wasn't quite the case. So there are some, it doesn't actually bring to anything in doctrinal terms. Like the English will fundamentally uniform to some competitive firearm doctrine, only imitating the Dutch after the reform of the 80s, basically of the 70s of the 17th century. All right, so we have really to await for the War of the League of Augsburg for Britain to have some fully uniformed infantry to the basis of the continental forces. And also the Dutch, as we were saying before, had just emerged as a competitive infantry for sort of the massive metus hostilis represented by Louis XIV's France. Does you understand how everything actually has a sense and a meaning? Nothing is random. Like, it's not like, oh, we don't know, it's maybe like this. Like, everything, if you know the story, flows, right? Because it's actual history. It's not somebody's fantasy. Unlike, unfortunately, many people think history actually is for them. So today we did something relatively different because I'd never really talked about arms and armor in merely like, okay, let's look at the units per se. It's obvious that there is a massively apological potential for any debate on Schwerpunkt, because we never really entered in the depths of actual apology when we talk about blades. I was talking about a good video on the Schiavona, for example, would be a huge deal, right? and very specialist. I personally don't specialize in arms and armor. Frankly, it's the thing that I find less interesting in warfare. But it's obvious that war is made with these tools, and so you have to understand exactly how that is the case. There is a specific technique. There's a physics of the sword, of firearms and everything. So ballistics, horsemanship, like it's a massive issue. You have to understand metallurgy, military engineering. So you know why we make thousands of videos. There is a reason for that. But what we've seen today is how fundamentally cavalry weapons of this period, 1500, 1650 roughly, represented a pragmatic fusion. The lance and sword for shock action, the composite bow for traditional mobile warfare in eastern theaters, and the wheel-lock pistol and arquebus for the emerging gunpowder era, from Polish Panserney thundering forward with spear and saber to German Reiter wielding their pistols in Caracole formations, Japanese samurai losing arrows before drawing blades in Sengoku clashes, or English troopers balancing sword and firearm amid the English Civil War's ideological struggles. Horsemen of this period mastered a lethal combination of inherited traditions and new innovations that shaped warfare for generations to come. When you look at this, again, always remember, this is not a agnostically separatistic vision of history. It's actually just highlighting here types of units to just make you see how, yeah, I know that type. So, and to frame it, however, more correctly in a bigger picture. Because after all, also weapons, as I said at the beginning, are fairly similar. Like if I talk about a warhammer, like the cavalry types, but they're fundamentally the same thing. But they can be in the hands of different types of knights that do different things. Same goes for, as we've seen before, for pistols, for also a certain type probably of fighting. Think about the Dragoons. So we discussed all of this in the video. And in general, I think that we're getting somewhere with this. What I've always been surprised with Schwerpunkt is how much modern warfare content we've made, even for being mostly a medieval history-based channel. And again, I'm very satisfied with this because we have a lot, especially in the 17th century. And I can't say it's a bad thing because honestly, confession moment, like if I had, like I originally wanted to study ancient history at university, then I ended up in medieval one, but if I had studied modern history, I would have probably specialized in the 17th century. I have this impression, that I don't know, probably because also when I entered medieval studies, I didn't know I would end up being a specialist in late 13th, first half 14th century warfare. Especially the latter seemed to me terrible. And I was scared by that. I was more into the 13th century. And instead, I found the way. But in general, I would say that this type of content is fairly good. Like there is a pretty extensively large amount of content that I think is worth focusing on. I have a Grand Siècle playlist created yesterday. I didn't realize I have 15 videos already about that. We have to cover more like Louis XIII's army. I think the Cardinals' armies. We covered Olivares' Spain armies, fundamentally, at the age of Philip IV. But this is just always a beginning. Like you see, even after thousands of videos, to me, it's never like, okay, we've gotten there, we can deem ourselves satisfied. That's not how it works. Like it's something much more complicated, and it actually needs some deeper reflection and work, and especially entering the depths of the various armies, because especially as far as modern warfare is concerned, it seems to me that there isn't really a massive so for, I don't know, ancient or medieval warfare, there is this wargamistic mentality where everybody knows the various units, whatever. When it comes to modern warfare, admittedly, everything is uniforming. In fact, what I should have sort of stressed, aside from these specific units, is that there are sometimes eccentric or iconic or whatever, is that there is a core of Western European warfare here that we're not seeing existing in France and also in later Germany, in Italy, etc., that is truly, like what kind of, we talk about the Jinetes, for example, but there is not an iconic, Spanish knight for this period. And actually, Spain had also pretty good cavalry at this point, but nobody has pictured it in some way. So we will also, again, make videos specifically about that. That's why, again, the other day I made a video about the Sun King's cavalry, that at least it's slightly more famous and present in some cultural representations, right? But when it comes, again, to this kind of history, it always feels as if we're missing something. That there is something that we were just, I don't know, that we could have discussed better and doesn't quite turn out the way we wanted. But I really feel instead that we are on the right track and we are doing fundamentally the right thing. Also because there isn't really some greater, I don't see channels covering this stuff. Like it's more some sort of strange summaries about this, short videos, 20 minutes. I think this stuff instead is quite interesting. I mean, I enjoy making these videos because they seem also dramatically necessary. Like if you don't picture this whole stuff, like how do you even go about it? Like it's sort of complicated to assess, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.